The Swedish capital, Stockholm. The city lies but a short distance across the Baltic Sea from the Soviet Union. And although Sweden is part of the West, it's also a neutral country, which makes Stockholm an ideal site for the East-West talks that began in mid-January and are likely to continue on and off for the next couple of years. The latest stage in the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe attracted hundreds of peace demonstrators, part of the growing peace movement in Western Europe. They were determined to make their voices heard, as well as the politicians. Foreign ministers from 35 states were sent to Stockholm, representing all of Europe except Albania, plus Canada and the United States. They were to continue the European security talks that started in 1975 with the Helsinki Final Agreement. The main aims: how to decrease tension and build up mutual confidence between East and West Europe. The importance of the Stockholm Conference, though, was greatly enhanced when it was announced rather late in the day that the Soviet Union and the United States would be represented at the opening by their leading representatives on foreign affairs. George Shultz, the American Secretary of State. And for the Soviet Union, the veteran Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. Their meeting would be the first top-level contacts between the superpowers for over 4 months. The hope was that Stockholm could mark the end of a period of bad relations between Washington and Moscow. The last high-level meeting between the two sides involved the same two men, Gromyko and Shultz. That was in Madrid in September 1983 at a review session of the continuing European Security Conference. Both men seemed reasonably happy with the way the conference was going. The conflict over American missiles in Europe still loomed in the background, of course, but the superpowers were at least talking to each other. But then came the event which cut the dialogue dead and caused the Madrid meeting to end in bitter exchanges. Out of the blue, out of the sky in Soviet airspace in the Far East came disaster. A South Korean airliner carrying 269 people was shot down by Soviet fighter planes. The South Koreans were appalled, the Americans incensed. President Reagan made a vitriolic attack on the Soviet Union and was echoed by Secretary of State Shultz.
This Madrid conference has been about the fundamental relationship between human rights and security. This brutal Soviet action has vividly displayed the Soviet Union's lack of concern for the human lives involved, and the preposterous explanation the Soviets have offered and continue to offer to a disbelieving world has only compounded the problem.
A few weeks later, the United States and its allies in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization took a step which threatened to have an equally disastrous effect on East-West relations. Cruise missiles arrived at Greenham Common in England, and Pershing II missiles arrived in West Germany. President Reagan and his allies insisted the new generation of nuclear missiles was necessary because the Warsaw Pact had got too far ahead in the arms race, and because the Soviet Union had rejected all of Reagan's arms reduction proposals. The almost inevitable response came in November in Geneva, where the talks on nuclear weapons in Europe are conducted by the two big powers at parallel meetings. The START talks on long-range strategic weapons and the INF talks on intermediate-range or tactical weapons. The START talks were already adjourned indefinitely, caught in an impasse of proposal and counter-proposal, but the INF talks were still going on, in spite of the bad feelings over the Korean airliner incident. But this meeting at the Soviet embassy between Paul Nitze, the chief American delegate, and his Soviet counterpart, Yuli Kvitsinski, turned out to be the last, for the foreseeable future at least. Peace demonstrators outside the embassy must have had mixed feelings on November 23rd when Mr. Kvitsinski led a Soviet walkout from the talks. He made it clear to waiting reporters that the two sides had nothing left to discuss.
Kvitsinski, can you tell us, did you walk out? Is it all over?
Состоялось заседание. Мы в ходе этого заседания заявили
During which we have stated
о прекращении нынешнего раунда переговоров
that the present round of the negotiations is discontinued
без установления какого-либо срока их возобновления.
without any date set for their resumption.
After these setbacks, the superpowers' attendance at Stockholm was widely seen as an encouraging sign that Cold War attitudes weren't frozen solid. Just 3 days before the conference opened, there came more hope of a possible warming of the political climate. President Reagan himself declared that the East-West dialogue had to be resumed.
We're witnessing tragic conflicts in many parts of the world. Nuclear arsenals are far too high, and our working relationship with the Soviet Union is not what it must be. These are conditions which must be addressed and improved. Deterrence is essential to preserve peace and protect our way of life. But deterrence is not the beginning and end of our policy toward the Soviet Union. We must and will engage the Soviets in a dialogue as serious and constructive as possible. A dialogue that will serve to promote peace in the troubled regions of the world, reduce the level of arms, and build a constructive working relationship. Neither we nor the Soviet Union can wish away the differences between our two societies and our philosophies. But we should always remember that we do have common interests. And the foremost among them is to avoid war and reduce the level of arms. There is no rational alternative but to steer a course which I would call credible deterrence and peaceful competition. And if we do so, we might find areas in which we could engage in constructive cooperation. Our strength and vision of progress provide the basis for demonstrating with equal conviction our commitment to stay secure and to find peaceful solutions to problems through negotiations. That's why 1984 is a year of opportunities for peace. We have a long way to go, but we're determined to try and try again. We may have to start in small ways, but start we must.
It was against this background that Secretary of State Schultz approached the rostrum for his opening speech in Stockholm. He outlined several areas where relations could be improved.
Arms control initiatives are part of a broader American effort to build a more stable, consistent, and constructive East-West relationship. A relationship not marked by abrupt shifts, exaggerated expectations, and dashed hopes of the last decade. While pursuing arms control, we have also sought to engage the Soviet Union in a candid dialogue on those regional crises and conflicts that threaten peace and poison our relationship. At the same time, we have proposed a range of bilateral measures to enhance both crisis communication and normal communication between us, to build confidence and to reduce any chance of misunderstanding or miscalculation. In Brussels last month, I joined my North Atlantic colleagues in extending to the Soviet Union and the other Warsaw Pact countries the offer to work together with us to bring about a long-term, constructive, and realistic relationship based on equilibrium, moderation, and reciprocity. For the benefit of mankind, the Alliance foreign ministers declared in Brussels, we advocate an open, comprehensive political dialogue, as well as cooperation based on mutual advantage. Let us therefore embark here and now upon this renewed, open, and comprehensive East-West political dialogue. Let us so conduct ourselves in our deliberations that historians of the future will mark this gathering as a turning point in East-West relations. Let the opening of this conference, which itself marks an important expansion in the scope of East-West negotiations, also mark a new step in the broader relationship. We are prepared to move forward.
The Soviet delegation spent the rest of the day analyzing the Schultz speech at the Soviet embassy and in their rented accommodation outside Stockholm. It had been, in fact, a low-key speech with no new ideas or proposals, but it did continue the conciliatory line taken by President Reagan, and the watching world's attention the following day was centered on Mr. Gromyko and his reply.
Полным ходом, с какой-то патологической одержимостью, идет строительство новых ракет.
Mr. Gromyko opened with a hard line, saying the Americans were churning out nuclear missiles, bombers, and aircraft carriers with a kind of pathological obsession. New weapons of mass destruction were being experimented with, and in short, the present American administration was thinking in terms of war.
категориями войны и поступающая соответственно. Повсюду в мире все решительнее звучит голос миллионов и миллионов людей.
All over the world, he said, millions and millions of voices are asking mankind to end the nuclear threat. If we are serious in our wish to remove this threat, then our approach to negotiations must be serious too.
Необходимое доверие в отношениях между странами, то и подход к устранению этой угрозы должен быть серьезным.
How greatly confidence would be improved if those states possessing nuclear weapons would give the undertaking not to use them first. It seems a simple measure, easy to implement, but without a first strike, there would be no second strike. Would that not result in a genuine political breakthrough in the business of confidence building?
Ведь без первого не будет и второго удара. Разве это не привело бы к настоящему политическому повороту в деле укрепления доверия, причем не только между ядерными державами.
Советский Союз в одностороннем порядке уже взял
на себя обязательство не применять первым ядерное оружие. Мы напоминаем об этом из трибуны Стокгольмской конференции.
The world's press was having a busy time. Major speeches by leading spokesmen for the two superpowers, and much political analysis going on. Inevitably, the same speeches and events were treated differently by the various national media. A small Soviet team of 5 men, for example, a senior Moscow journalist and the Stockholm correspondent, backed up by a 3-man film crew, was covering the conference.
Безопасности, укрепление доверия обсуждается не только в зале самой конференции.
The Soviet correspondent says that the big issues of world peace and security are being discussed not only inside the conference and in the corridors, but also outside in Stockholm's central square. He refers not to peace demonstrators and activists, as a Western correspondent might, but to a meeting organized by Swedish trade unions, worker and public groups.
Людей на эту площадь?
One man seeks disarmament and a guarantee of peace.
Precis detsamma, så att varje steg i den här riktningen i alla fall, där folk kan samlas och tala med varandra, är ett steg i rätt riktning. Även om det inte kanske kan ge så stora resultat i förstone.
Государства-участники конференции с полной ответственностью должны обеспечить успешную работу Стокгольмской конференции, содействовать устранению ядерной угрозы, нависшей над народами, прекращению безумной гонки вооружений.
In contrast, this is the editing and transmission point for just one of the 4 American TV networks covering the conference. They use the latest electronic gear, and the team numbers 13, including 3 reporters, 3 producers, and 6 technicians.
Everybody is right. We don't want them to fight it.
Go.
Soldier.
Okay.
Is it re-racked?
Yes, it is.
Right, Peter, go downstairs, mate, if you would. I'll talk to you on the radio.
The news crew edits and feeds news packages back to the United States and also uses a direct satellite link from the conference center studio. This is ABC Chief European Correspondent Pierre Salinger.
Well, it's hard to tell, although the Soviets failed in their effort with public opinion to halt the deployment of the first missiles. The tough Gromyko speech is obviously an effort to keep the pressure on public opinion in Europe to prevent further deployment. But I believe the Atlantic Alliance is very firm. Their position is we will not be intimidated, but we want dialogue.
Salinger is answering questions he hears through an earphone during the peak evening newscast in the United States.
Well, I think that's one of the most surprising things that's happened, Peter, is the concern that's been expressed by some Eastern European delegates here to this conference about the harsh nature of the dialogue of Mr. Gromyko. They're concerned about it, and they say it shows the Soviet Union is leaderless and has no foreign policy.
Distinctly different presentation methods, then, from the two sides. And for an opinion from the middle ground, we visited the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which closely monitors East-West contacts.
Turning to the Schultz and Gromyko meeting,
we asked their spokesman, Frank Blackaby, if the Schultz-Gromyko meeting would just be an exercise in grasping at straws.
I think it's a bit of a straw. Here we are saying how wonderful it is that the foreign ministers of the two superpowers are actually talking to each other without any consideration of what they're going to say. We know they're not going to negotiate. But is this such a big deal that they're actually in the same room together and conversing? I think that's, we've come to a pretty pass when just stating the fact that the foreign ministers of the Soviet Union and the United States are speaking to each other is regarded as a great herald of oncoming peace. The issues are still big issues. It's most unlikely that the Soviet Union will draw back from the statement it's now made on a very large number of occasions, that it will talk about nuclear missiles in Europe when the new missiles are withdrawn. Well, they won't be withdrawn. So that side of the Geneva negotiations, I think, are dead for all time. The new negotiations will have to be negotiations which cover both the strategic and the intermediate missiles. I can see no alternative to that eventual solution, and I don't see that coming soon either.
The Soviet embassy in Stockholm was the center of attention as Gromyko and Schultz arrived for their meeting, the first since last September. The interest was intense. It could herald the start of a thaw in relations, the resumption of arms talks, and of a serious dialogue reflecting the declared aims of the Helsinki Final Act. But would the meeting live up to expectations? The two sides talked for 5 hours, 10 minutes. American officials were unusually reticent afterwards, saying that there were differences, but the discussions were good ones. No new announcement then on the perennial issue of how to reduce the massive arsenals of arms on each side, and no indication that the Soviet Union is ready to return to the INF talks in Geneva. In fact, unofficial American sources say that Gromyko's last words to Schultz were that if he even hinted at the possibility of the talks resuming, the Russian side would immediately issue a categorical denial. This helps to explain the absence of any official communique afterwards. There was more encouraging news, though, from the West European countries in the NATO alliance. Without any great fanfare of trumpets, it was announced by both sides a few days later that negotiations will begin again mid-March in Vienna at the MBFR talks, the initial standing for Mutual and Balanced Force Reduction. Their aim is to reduce the number of conventional weapons. At the Stockholm conference, hopes are high that NATO and the Warsaw Pact will agree on improving confidence-building measures, like notifying notifying the other side of military maneuvers and inviting in foreign observers, a system that has been put only partly into operation so far. At the center of East-West relations since the Second World War, and often acting as a kind of barometer, is Berlin. The Berlin Wall is still shown off to Western visitors as a condemnation of the communist system. But Berlin is a good example of how East and West can talk about a difficult problem. Since the four-power agreement in the early 70s, Berlin has ceased to be a trouble spot. So why no progress elsewhere? Since the late 70s, though, the much-talked-about detente hit serious trouble. In the last week of 1979, Soviet troops intervened in Afghanistan, installing a new communist government under Babrak Karmal. This brought Soviet troops into direct conflict with Afghan rebels. The fighting still goes on, providing a wealth of propaganda material for the West. The growth of the independent trade union in Poland, Solidarity, also provided ammunition for critics of the communist system. Although the Soviet Union did not intervene militarily, they put so much pressure on the government that Solidarity was banned, and the government imposed martial law for a year. The Polish situation remains a cause of friction in Europe. Then, in September, the disastrous incident of the South Korean airliner. The Soviet Union insisted that the airliner was involved in a United States-inspired spying mission over sensitive military installations, and that the Russian fighter pilot was justified in his action. But the bits of wreckage washed up on Japanese beaches reflected the wrecking of detente, at any rate for several months. Throughout the recent crises, though, East-West relations have never reverted to the days of the Cold War. And the natural gas pipeline project from the Soviet Union to Western Europe is a good example. The pipeline, still being built, will carry natural gas all the way from Siberia into West European homes. Both sides will benefit. Simple economic fact that has ensured the pipeline's survival. The Reagan administration had called for a halt to the project in protest over the Poland situation. But for once, America's West European allies ignored the signals from Washington. Access to high technology is another current problem. Washington claims American high-tech equipment is being smuggled into the Soviet Union via Western Europe. The Americans now want to control anything that might help the Russians in the military field. But, as with the pipeline, normal commercial pressures, in America as well as in Europe, are likely to make a complete ban impossible. After the turmoil of recent months, the general view is that no early breakthrough can be expected in Stockholm. But there's also an underlying feeling of optimism over the longer term, a view that's shared by the chief American delegate to the conference, Ambassador James Goodby.
It's realistic to hold out some hope, but I think that we should not delude ourselves into thinking that we can reach agreements quickly or easily. There is, I think, a real prospect for success here, but I think, frankly, it will come only after a period of probably rather sharp debate. I suspect we're going to be discussing a number of issues that, in my opinion, would be extraneous to the real purposes of this conference. I think we'll have to go through that kind of rough period, but I do think that, in the end, there are some chances of reaching some agreements that, though modest, I think may achieve some positive results.
Perhaps the most optimistic people in Stockholm and the most idealistic are the peace campaigners of all ages and nationalities. They kept up a determined but good-natured vigil outside the conference center. The peace people have of a simple solution to banish tensions: disarmament. Their hope is that Stockholm will bring at least the start of a process leading down that long